The wheelwright's mallet rang against the iron rim one last time, and Quinton Moss stepped back to admire the repair, before remembering he still had to count chains in a debt wagon like livestock in a pen. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a kerchief already black from forge work, and glanced toward the contractor's wagon sitting in the shade of the workyard's oak. The wheel repair had been straightforward enough, but Harvey Klein, the debt contractor, had insisted on an inventory of the shackle sets before payment would change hands. Quinton had built wheels for freight haulers, farmers' carts, and even the mayor's carriage, but this was his first contract with a labor crew, and the taste of it sat sour in his mouth. "Need to make sure none of my property walked off with the hardware," Klein had said with a grin that showed too many teeth. Quinton gathered his tools and crossed the packed earth yard toward the wagon. The sun hung heavy over the eastern hills, promising another scorching afternoon. Summer had settled over the frontier county like a wool blanket, and the road crews had been working double shifts to finish the new bridge before autumn rains turned the valley into a mud trap. The wagon's rear gate hung open. Inside, bolted to the floor and walls, were 12 sets of shackles, each consisting of ankle irons connected by a short chain to a ring set into the planking. Quinton pulled out his ledger and a piece of graphite, forcing himself to approach the task with the same methodical care he brought to measuring wheel spokes. He had just finished counting the port side when he heard the work gang returning from the morning's gravel haul. Boots and bare feet shuffled across the yard, and he looked up to see them. 8 humans, 3 dwarves, and 1 orc woman, all wearing the gray tunics that marked them as debt labor. They moved with the particular exhaustion of people who had been working since dawn, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. The orc woman walked near the back of the group, and Quinton found his count faltering as he watched her. She was tall but willowy, her frame suggesting someone who had lost weight recently or simply never had enough to begin with. Her skin was the deep green of summer oak leaves, and her dark hair hung in a single braid down her back. Small tusks curved up from her lower jaw, and her pointed ears were visible even through the dust that coated her. She caught him staring and looked away quickly, her shoulders drawing inward in a way that made Quinton feel ashamed of his attention. "Eyes on the work, Moss," Klein called from the shade where he sat with a jug of ale. "Those chains won't count themselves." Quinton returned to his ledger, scratching down numbers with more force than necessary. He finished the inventory, confirmed all 12 sets were present and accounted for, and walked over to present the contractor with both his repair invoice and the shackle count. Klein studied the papers with the slow deliberation of a man who had learned to read late in life. "Good work on the wheel. Ride smooth now. I will have your payment by week's end." "The terms were payment on completion," Quinton said evenly, "and you will get it. Week's end." Klein folded the papers and tucked them into his vest, "unless you want to take it up with the road commission." Quinton held the man's gaze for a long moment, weighing the value of pushing back against the likelihood of ever getting another contract from the commission. Finally, he nodded once and turned to gather his tools. The work gang had been given a quarter-hour to rest and take water. They sat in whatever shade they could find, drinking from a communal bucket with a ladle that got passed hand to hand. Quinton watched the orc woman wait until everyone else had drunk before taking her turn, and even then she only allowed herself a single ladleful before setting the dipper back. He loaded his tools into his own cart, a sturdy 2-wheeler he had built himself 5 years ago when he left the army and set up shop. The workyard sat at the crossroads between the county road and the river pike, convenient for catching trade from both directions. His workshop was a mile north, close enough to walk but far enough that he could leave the noise and dust of the crossroads behind at day's end. As he settled the last of his equipment and prepared to depart, he heard Klein shouting at the gang to get back to loading gravel. The afternoon shift would take them south to the bridge site, where they would haul stone until sunset. Quinton had made it perhaps 20 yards down the road when he stopped, stood still for a moment with his hands on the cart handles, and then turned around. He found Klein overseeing the loading, barking orders while the gang shoveled gravel from a pile into the bed of a different wagon. Quinton waited until there was a pause in the work before approaching. "I want to buy out one of your contracts," he said. Klein's eyebrows rose. "That's so. Which one caught your fancy? The orc woman?" "Ah," Klein grinned and scratched his chin. "She is one of my better workers, actually. Quiet, does not complain, follows orders. You understand that makes her more valuable, not less." "I understand mathematics. What is the remaining debt?" Klein pulled a small ledger from his pocket and flipped through pages stained with what might have been gravy or tobacco juice. "Let's see here. Jessa Aerith. Bought her contract 6 months ago. Original debt was for her brother's unpaid river toll plus the penalty fees. Came to 18 silver. She has worked off 3 silver worth at the standard rate, which leaves 15 silver remaining, plus my acquisition fee and the administration costs. How much total?" 22 silver. Quinton did the math in his head. 22 silver was nearly 3 years of careful savings, the money he had been setting aside to expand his workshop and maybe hire an apprentice. It was an absurd amount for a single debt contract. The standard rate for contract buyout is the remaining principal plus 10%, Quinton said. "That would be 16.5 silver. Standard rate is for humans," Klein replied. "Orc contracts carry additional risk. They are more likely to run, more likely to cause trouble. I need to be compensated for taking that on. She has not run in 6 months. Which is why I'm only asking 22 instead of 30. Klein closed his ledger and returned it to his pocket. "That is my price. Take it or leave it." Quinton looked past the contractor to where the orc woman, Jessa, was shoveling gravel with mechanical efficiency, her eyes fixed on the work. She had not looked up once during the entire conversation, but something in the set of her shoulders told him she was listening. "I will take it," Quinton said, "but I need to go to town to get the money from the bank. I can be back before sunset. No need to rush." "I will hold her here until you return with the coin." Klein stuck out his hand. "We have a deal." Quinton shook it, feeling the calluses on the contractor's palm and wondering what kind of man made his living off other people's misfortune. Then again, he had served in the army for 8 years, driving supply wagons and shoeing horses, and he had never once asked what cargo the prisoner transports carried. Maybe he had no room to judge. He made the trip to town in good time, his cart rattling empty over the rutted road. The bank was a small brick building on the main square, run by a severe woman named Mrs. Holloway, who treated every withdrawal like a personal betrayal. She counted out his 22 silver with pursed lips and made him sign 3 different forms before she would hand over the coins. "That is a significant sum, Mr. Moss," she said. "I hope you are making a sound investment." "I hope so too," Quinton replied, though he was not entirely sure what he was investing in. The sun was starting its descent when he returned to the work yard. The gravel wagon had departed for the bridge site, but Klein was still there, sitting in his usual spot with his jug. Jessa sat on the ground near the debt wagon, her hands shackled in front of her. "Ah, you came back," Klein said, rising to his feet. "I was wondering if you might have second thoughts." "No second thoughts." Quinton pulled the pouch of coins from his belt and handed it over. 22 silver, as agreed. Klein counted the money twice, his lips moving silently before nodding in satisfaction. He pulled out a key ring and selected a small brass key, then walked over to where Jessa sat. "On your feet," he said. She rose slowly, her movements stiff from sitting in the heat. Klein unlocked the shackles from her wrists and tossed them into the wagon with a clatter. "The ankle irons too," Quinton said. "Those stay on until the paperwork is transferred," Klein replied. "Standard procedure. The paperwork can be done with her unchained." Klein studied him for a moment, then shrugged and knelt to unlock the ankle shackles as well. Jessa stood perfectly still through the process, her face expressionless. Once the irons were off, Klein pulled out a contract form and began filling it in with a stubby pencil. Name of buyer, Quinton Moss. Name of contracted party, Jessa Erith. Remaining debt, 15 silver. Acquisition fee, 6.5 silver. Total paid, 22 silver. Debt transferred in full as of this date. He signed with a flourish and handed the paper to Quinton. "She is all yours, work her well." Quinton took the contract, read it over carefully, and then did something that made both Klein and Jessa stare at him. He tore the paper in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter to the ground. "What are you doing?" Klein demanded. Quinton ignored him and turned to Jessa. He met her eyes, which were a striking amber color, and said, "You are free. No debt, no service owed, no contract. You can go wherever you want." Jessa stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked down at the torn pieces of contract on the ground, then back up at Quinton. "I do not understand," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, with a slight rasp to it as though from disuse. "I bought out your contract and now I am ending it," Quinton said. "You are free." "This is highly irregular," Klein interjected. "The commission requires proper documentation of all contract terminations. Then you can document that I terminated it immediately upon purchase." Quinton kept his eyes on Jessa. "You do not owe me anything. You do not have to work for me or follow me or do anything at all. You are free to make your own choices." Jessa was silent for a long moment. Her hands, freed from the shackles, hung at her sides, and Quinton could see the raw marks on her wrists where the irons had rubbed. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. "Then I choose you," she whispered. The words hit Quinton like a physical blow. He shook his head quickly. "No, you do not have to choose anything right now. You have not had time to think, to figure out what you actually want. I want to stay with you. You do not know me. You do not know if I am any better than him." Quinton gestured toward Klein, who was watching the exchange with obvious confusion. "You just got free. Take time to feel it before you decide to give it up again." "I am not giving it up," Jessa said, and there was something fierce in her voice now. "I am choosing. That is different. Not if you have not had a real chance to choose something else." Quinton ran a hand through his hair, trying to figure out how to make her understand. "Listen. I have a workshop about a mile north of here. I can offer you work if you want it, real work with real pay. But you will have your own room, your own coin, your own time. You work for yourself, not for me. And if you decide tomorrow or next week or next month that you want to leave and do something else, then you leave. No debt, no obligation." "Why would you do this?" Jessa asked. Quinton thought about the prisoner wagons he had driven during the war, the ones with the reinforced floors and the barred windows. He thought about how he had never let himself wonder who was inside or where they were going. "Because I should have done something like this a long time ago," he said finally. Klein cleared his throat. "Well, this has been fascinating, but I have work to attend to. Moss, you paid for the contract fair and square, so what you do with it is your business. Just keep in mind that the commission frowns on fraud, and if you try to claim a labor credit for work she did not actually do, there will be consequences." I will not be claiming any labor credits, Quinton said. Suit yourself. Klein gathered his things and headed toward his own wagon. Pleasure doing business with you, even if you are touched in the head. Once the contractor had driven off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake, Quinton turned back to Jessa. She was still standing in the same spot, looking somewhat lost now that the shackles were gone and her erstwhile owner had departed. "Are you hungry?" Quinton asked. Jessa hesitated, then nodded. "There is a tavern just down the river pike that serves decent food. We can get something to eat and then I will show you where the workshop is." He paused. "If you want to come along, that is. You do not have to." "I want to," Jessa said quietly. They walked to Quinton's cart and he helped her climb up onto the bench seat beside him. It was the first time he had seen her standing at full height, and he realized she was nearly as tall as he was, though she probably weighed a good deal less. The gray work tunic hung loose on her frame, and he could see the sharp angles of her collarbones above the neckline. The tavern was a squat building with a thatched roof and a painted sign showing a trout jumping from a stream. Inside, it was dim and cool, with a handful of patrons scattered among the tables. The tavern keeper, a stocky man with an impressive beard, looked up as they entered and his eyes narrowed slightly when he saw Jessa. "We are here for a meal, not trouble," Quinton said evenly. The tavern keeper grunted. "Coin is coin. What do you want?" "2 bowls of whatever you have cooking and bread if you have it. Turnip stew and barley bread. 4 copper." Quinton paid and they took a table near the back. The stew arrived in wooden bowls, steaming and thick with chunks of turnip, carrot, and something that might have been mutton. Jessa stared at her bowl for a moment before picking up the spoon. She ate slowly at first, then faster, as though she could not quite believe the food would still be there if she did not finish it quickly. Quinton ate his own portion and tried not to watch her too obviously. When she had scraped the last of the stew from her bowl and eaten every crumb of bread, she set down her spoon and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome." "I still do not understand why you did this." Quinton considered how to answer. "I worked for the army for 8 years, he said slowly. "I drove supply wagons mostly, but sometimes they had me drive other things. Prisoner transports. I never looked inside those wagons, never asked where the prisoners were going or what would happen to them. I just drove the route and collected my pay and told myself it was not my business." He met her eyes. "I think about that sometimes. All the people I hauled without ever seeing their faces." Jessa was quiet for a moment. "You think buying my freedom makes up for that?" "No," Quinton said honestly. "I do not think anything makes up for it. But I saw you today and I had the money and I thought maybe I could do one thing that was not just looking away." "My brother died because he could not pay a toll," Jessa said. Her voice was steady but there was pain underneath it. 3 copper for the river ferry. He did not have it. The ferryman said he could work it off, but Cale had a fever and he collapsed on the 2nd day. They charged his corpse with breach of contract and sold the debt to me because I was next of kin." "That is not legal," Quinton said, anger flaring in his chest. "It is if you are an orc." Jessa's smile was bitter. "The magistrate said Cale had entered into a contract willingly and the debt had to be satisfied. 18 silver, which might as well have been 18 gold for all the chance I had of paying it." "How long were you in the gang?" 6 months with Klein. 3 months with another contractor before that, but he sold my contract when he went bankrupt. 9 months of hauling gravel and sleeping in a chain wagon. Quinton felt the weight of it settle over the table like a physical presence. "What did you do before?" he asked. "Before the debt?" "I was a seamstress. I worked in a shop in Milford doing repairs and alterations." Jessa looked down at her hands, which were calloused now and scarred from rough work. I was saving up to buy my own needles and thread, maybe take on private clients. That was the plan anyway. Can you still sew? I do not know. It has been a while. She flexed her fingers experimentally. I think so if I had the materials. I could use some curtains for the workshop, Quinton said. And my shirts are all falling apart because I cannot sew worth a damn. If you wanted to do that kind of work, I could pay you. Proper wages, same as I would pay anyone else. Jessa studied him with those amber eyes, and Quinton had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing right through him, measuring his words against his intentions. What do you really want from me? She asked. I want you to have a real choice, Quinton said. I want you to have enough time and enough safety to figure out what you want to do with your freedom. And if what you want is to stay and work in my shop, then I want you to know you are doing it because you chose to, not because you felt like you owed me. And if I choose to leave, then you leave, and I hope you find something good wherever you go. Jessa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her empty bowl. Finally, she said, I would like to see this workshop of yours. They finished at the tavern and climbed back into the cart. The sun was lower now, painting the hills in shades of orange and gold. The road north was quieter than the main crossroads, passing through farmland and scattered woodland. Quinton's workshop sat on a piece of land he had bought with his army discharge pay, a clearing large enough for the shop building, a small house, and a barn for storage. The workshop itself was a solid structure of timber and stone, with wide doors that could be thrown open to let in light and air. Various wheels in different states of completion leaned against the walls, and the air smelled of wood shavings and iron. Behind the workshop was the house, smaller but well built, with a fieldstone chimney and real glass in the windows. Quinton had done most of the construction himself over the course of his first 2 years out of the army, learning carpentry through trial and error, and the occasional advice from neighboring farmers. The house has 2 rooms upstairs that I do not use, Quinton said as they stood in the yard. You can have your pick of them. There is a well out back and the privy is behind the barn. It is not fancy, but it is solid. Jessa turned in a slow circle, taking in the workshop, the house, the cleared land around them. You live here alone, just me. It gets quiet sometimes, but I do not mind it. Quinton led her to the house and opened the door. Inside was a main room with a fireplace, a table, and a few chairs, all built by his own hands and showing the improvement in his skill over time. A ladder led up to the second floor. Jessa climbed the ladder and Quinton heard her footsteps moving across the floor above. When she came back down, her expression was unreadable. The room on the left has a better window, she said. Then it is yours. Quinton went to a shelf and pulled down a spare blanket and a pillow. I do not have much in the way of furniture up there yet, but I can build you a bed frame if you want. For tonight, the blanket and pillow will have to do. Jessa took the bedding, holding it against her chest like something precious. I have slept on worse. You should not have had to sleep on anything worse, Quinton said. But we can work on making it better from here. They stood in the fading light of the main room, and Quinton realized he had no idea what came next. He had bought a woman's freedom on impulse, brought her home and offered her work and shelter, all without thinking through the practicalities of what it meant to suddenly have another person living in his space. Are you tired? He asked. A little. Then you should rest. Tomorrow we can talk about what kind of work you might want to do, and I can take you into town to get some proper clothes and supplies. He paused. And we should probably figure out the pay arrangement. I was thinking $1 a week to start, plus room and board. Does that sound fair? Jessa blinked. $1 a week. If you think it should be more, we can negotiate. No, she shook her head. In the work gang, we earned 1/4 copper a day. Quinton did the math. A quarter copper per day for 6 days of hard labor came to a copper and a half per week, and that was before the contractor took out fees for food and shelter. A silver was worth 12 copper. "You are not in a work gang anymore," he said firmly. "You are a skilled worker and you will be paid accordingly. If you do sewing work, we can talk about piece rates instead of weekly pay, whatever makes more sense." "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything tonight. Just get some rest." Quinton gestured toward the ladder. "I will be down here if you need anything." Jessa climbed the ladder slowly, carrying her blanket and pillow. Quinton heard her moving around in the room above, the creak of floorboards as she settled in. He sat at his table for a while, listening to the evening sounds of insects and distant birds, and wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. The next morning, Quinton woke early out of long habit and started a fire in the hearth. He was mixing batter for griddle cakes when Jessa came down the ladder, her hair still in its braid and her gray work tunic dusty in the morning light. "I thought you might be hungry," Quinton said, gesturing to the griddle heating over the fire. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage breakfast." "I can cook," Jessa offered, "if you want. Only if you want to. You are not here to be my housekeeper. I know, but I like cooking, and you did say you wanted to pay me for work." She moved to the fire and examined the griddle. "Do you have eggs in the cold box?" "And there is bacon in the larder." They made breakfast together, working around each other in the small space with an ease that surprised Quinton. Jessa cooked with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make meals quickly and with limited resources, and soon the smell of bacon and eggs filled the house. They ate at the table, and Quinton found himself watching the way Jessa savored each bite, taking her time now that she did not have to worry about the food disappearing. "I was thinking we could go into town today," Quinton said. "Get you some clothes and whatever else you need. There is a general store that carries fabric and sewing supplies too if you want to pick up materials." Jessa nodded. "I would like that. And we should probably open an account for you at the bank so you have a place to keep your wages. I do not know if they will let me. Banks usually do not take ORC customers. Then we will find one that does, or I will keep your money in my account under your name until we figure it out." Quinton pushed his empty plate aside. "One way or another, you will have control over your own earnings." They cleaned up from breakfast and hitched the cart for the trip into town. The morning was clear and cool, with a breeze that carried the scent of hay from the surrounding farms. Jessa sat beside Quinton on the bench, her posture gradually relaxing as they drove. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Of course." "What made you leave the army?" Quinton was quiet for a moment, his hand steady on the reins. "I got tired of following orders that I did not agree with," he said finally. "And I wanted to build things instead of hauling them around for other people to use. The army gives you a trade if you do not have one, and I learned wheelwrighting and farrier work, so when my term was up I took my discharge pay and came out here to set up shop." "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes I miss the certainty of it. You wake up, you do your job, you follow the routine. There is something comfortable about that, even when the work is hard." He glanced at her. "But no, I do not miss it enough to go back. This is better." Town was busier than it had been the previous day, with farmers bringing in produce and merchants setting up stalls in the square. Quinton parked the cart near the general store and helped Jessa down. Inside, the store was crowded with goods, everything from bolts of fabric to tools to barrels of flour. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles, looked up as they entered. "Morning, Moss," he said, then his gaze shifted to Jessa and his expression cooled slightly. "Help you find something. My associate needs some clothes and sewing supplies," Quinton said, putting a slight emphasis on the word associate. "We will browse for a bit." They moved through the store, Jessa running her fingers over fabrics and examining spools of thread with the eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. Quinton let her choose what she wanted, only interjecting to suggest she get more than the bare minimum. "You will need work clothes and something nicer for town," he said, "and a good coat for when the weather turns." "This is too much," Jessa protested, looking at the growing pile of goods. "It is an investment in my business," Quinton replied. "If you are going to be doing sewing work, you need the right tools and materials. Consider it part of your employment arrangement." By the time they were done, they had 2 dresses, a work tunic and trousers, a heavy coat, a pair of good boots, and an array of sewing supplies that included needles, thread in various colors, scissors, and several yards of fabric for practice. The total came to nearly 2 silver, and the proprietor counted the coins with barely concealed surprise. Their next stop was the bank, where Mrs. Holloway greeted them with her usual stern expression that deepened into a frown when she saw Jessa. "Mr. Moss," she said, "what can I do for you today?" "I would like to open an account for my employee," Quinton said. "I see." Mrs. Holloway's gaze flicked to Jessa. "And does your employee have documentation of free status?" "She does not need documentation. I am vouching for her." Bank policy requires proof of free status for all non-human account holders. We cannot accept accounts from individuals who may be under debt contract or other legal encumbrance. Quinton felt his jaw tighten. "I purchased and immediately voided her contract yesterday. She is as free as I am." "Then you will need to provide documentation of the contract termination. A signed statement from the original debt holder and a witness will suffice." Getting anything signed by Klein would be a nightmare, and Quinton knew it. He took a breath and tried a different approach. "What if I open a second account in my name with her listed as the authorized user?" Mrs. Holloway considered this. "That would be acceptable, though I should note that legally, the funds would be considered your property, not hers." "I understand. We will do it that way for now." Quinton pulled out the paperwork and filled in the necessary information, listing Jessa as the authorized user on a new account. He deposited 1 silver to start it off. "She can make withdrawals and deposits." "With your written authorization, yes." "Then consider this my standing authorization for Jessa Erith to manage this account as she sees fit." Quinton signed the statement and pushed it across the desk. "Anything else?" Mrs. Holloway filed the paperwork with pursed lips. "That will do for now. Good day, Mr. Moss." Outside, Jessa was quiet as they walked back to the cart. Quinton loaded their purchases into the back and helped her up to the bench. "I am sorry about that," he said. "I should have anticipated they would make it difficult." "You got me an account," Jessa said. "That is more than I expected." "It is not really your account if it is in my name. It is more freedom than I had yesterday." She looked at him. "You keep trying to give me things and I keep not knowing how to take them." "You do not have to take them any particular way," Quinton said. "Just use them. That is enough." They drove back to the workshop in comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Jessa carried her new belongings up to her room while Quinton went to the shop to work on a wheel repair he had been putting off. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. Quinton worked in the shop during the day, building and repairing wheels for the steady stream of customers who came down the road. Jessa set up a sewing station in the corner of the main house, near the window for good light, and began taking on work. At first, it was simple things: mending Quinton's shirts, hemming the new dresses she had bought, making the curtains he had mentioned. But as her hands remembered their old skill, she grew more ambitious. She made a quilt for her bed, piecing together scraps of fabric into a pattern of interlocking stars. She sewed new cushions for the chairs in the main room. She even made Quinton a new work apron with reinforced pockets for his tools. "You did not have to do that," he said when she presented it to him. "I wanted to," Jessa replied. "You said I could choose what work to do. I chose this." Quinton paid her the silver a week they had agreed upon. And every week, Jessa went to the bank to deposit most of it into the account that bore Quinton's name but felt increasingly like hers. She kept a few copper for small purchases, and Quinton noticed she was starting to fill out a bit, her face less hollow and her movements less tentative. They took their meals together, usually cooked by Jessa, who had taken over the kitchen with Quinton's grateful approval. She made simple, hearty food, stews and roasted vegetables and bread that was better than anything Quinton had managed on his own. They talked while they ate, carefully at first and then more freely as the days passed. Quinton learned that Jessa had grown up in a small orc community in the hills to the west, that she had 3 younger sisters she had not seen since being sold into the work gang, that her favorite color was blue, and she had a deep fear of confined spaces that made her time in the chain wagon even worse than it otherwise would have been. Jessa learned that Quinton had been an orphan, raised in a foundling home until he was old enough to enlist, that he had a gift for working with wood and metal, but could not carry a tune to save his life, that he had nightmares sometimes about the war but did not like to talk about them. As summer aged into autumn, word began to spread about the orc woman living at the wheelwright's place. Some of Quinton's regular customers stopped coming, taking their business to a farrier 2 towns over. Others came by specifically to gawk, and Quinton turned them away with a coldness that surprised even himself. But there were also customers who did not seem to care, or who even approved. A farmer's wife brought fabric and asked Jessa to make her daughter a dress for the harvest festival. A merchant hired her to repair the upholstery in his carriage. Slowly, Jessa began to build her own clientele, and the small pile of coins in her account grew larger. One evening in early autumn, as they sat at the table after dinner, Jessa said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" Quinton was working on sketches for a new cart design, his charcoal moving across the paper in rough strokes. "About what you said when you freed me, about how I had not had time to know what I wanted." Quinton set down his charcoal and gave her his full attention. "I have had time now," Jessa continued. 3 months. I have had my own room, my own money, my own work. I have had space to think and choose." She met his eyes. "And I still choose you." Quinton's chest tightened. "Jessa, let me finish," she said. "I know you think I am just grateful, or that I am choosing you because you saved me. But that is not what this is. I choose you because you gave me space to breathe, and then stayed close enough that I did not have to breathe alone. I choose you because you pay me fairly and eat my cooking and laugh at my jokes even when they are not very funny. I choose you because when I imagine my future, you are in it, and when you are not, the future looks emptier." "I am not good at this," Quinton said quietly. "I have lived alone for 5 years. I do not know how to be with someone." "Neither do I," Jessa replied, "but we could learn together if you wanted to." Quinton looked at her across the table, this woman who had been starving and shackled when he met her, and who was now healthy and free, and choosing him anyway. He thought about the mornings when he woke to the smell of breakfast cooking, the evenings when they sat together in companionable silence, the slow, steady way she had woven herself into the fabric of his life. "I want to," he said, "but I need you to know something first." "What?" Quinton took a breath and let himself say the thing he had not spoken aloud to anyone. "When I was in the army, I drove prisoner transports. I told you that. What I did not tell you is that I knew what was in those wagons. Maybe I did not look, but I knew. Everyone knew. And I drove them anyway, because it was my job and I needed the pay and it was easier not to think about it." He met her eyes. "I was part of the system that put you in chains, Jessa. Maybe not directly, but I was part of it. And I do not know if I should be allowed to have something good when I spent years making sure other people did not. Jessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "You think I do not know what guilt feels like," she said. "My brother died because I did not have 3 copper to give him for the toll. I had spent my money on new fabric for a dress I wanted to make, something pretty for myself, and when he needed help, I had nothing. I have carried that for 9 months, Quinton. I know what it is to feel like you do not deserve good things." "It is not the same," Quinton said. "No, it is not. Your guilt is bigger and more complicated than mine, but the shape of it is the same." She squeezed his hand. "You cannot drive those wagons backward. You cannot undo what you did. All you can do is choose differently now, and you have. You are. That has to count for something." "Does it count enough?" "I think so," Jessa said, "but you are the only one who can decide if it counts enough for you." Quinton looked down at their joined hands, her green skin against his pale, calloused palm. He thought about the choice she was offering him, the chance to build something good out of the wreckage of their respective pasts. "I do not know if I can be what you deserve," he said. "You do not get to decide what I deserve," Jessa replied. "I decide that, and I say you are enough." So Quinton chose to believe her, or at least to try. They did not have a grand moment of declaration or a dramatic kiss in the firelight. What they had instead was Quinton squeezing her hand back and saying, "All right, we will try." And Jessa smiling, really smiling in a way that made her whole face light up. Things changed after that, but slowly. Quinton started sitting closer to her in the evenings. Jessa began touching him more casually, a hand on his shoulder when she passed behind his chair, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his plate at meals. They talked more freely, laughing over shared jokes and debating the merits of different wood finishes with the passion of people who had opinions about such things. Winter came early that year, bringing snow in thick blankets that muffled the world. Work slowed as the roads became difficult to travel, but Quinton had enough saved to see them through, and Jessa's sewing brought in a steady trickle of income from customers who braved the weather to commission repairs and new garments. They spent long evenings by the fire, Quinton carving pieces for a new project and Jessa stitching by lamplight. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of thread through fabric. It was on one such evening, deep into winter when the snow was piled high against the house, and the world seemed to consist only of their warm room, that Jessa said, "Tell me about the first time you built something just for yourself." Quinton looked up from the piece of oak he was shaping. "What do you mean? You said you wanted to build things instead of hauling them. What was the first thing you built after you left the army, something that was just yours?" Quinton thought back. "This table, actually. I needed furniture and I did not want to pay for it when I could make it myself. It took me 3 tries to get the legs level." Jessa ran her hand over the worn wood. "It is a good table." "It is an adequate table," Quinton corrected. "I've gotten better since then." "Show me something you are proud of then." Quinton set down his carving and went to a chest in the corner. He pulled out a wooden box, perhaps a foot square, with a lid that fit so perfectly it seemed to disappear into the frame. The wood was cherry, polished to a deep glow, and the corners were joined with tiny, precise dovetails. "I made this last year," he said, handing it to Jessa. "I was practicing joinery and I wanted to see if I could make something that was just about the craft, not about utility." Jessa opened the box, admiring the smooth interior. "It is beautiful. What do you keep in it?" "Nothing. I just like knowing I made it." "You should keep something important in it," Jessa said. "Something that matters to you." "Like what?" She closed the box and handed it back to him. You will know when you find it. The winter deepened and the new year arrived. Quinton and Jessa celebrated quietly, with a special meal and a bottle of wine Quinton had been saving. They sat close on the bench by the fire, Jessa's head resting on his shoulder, and Quinton felt a contentment he had not known he was capable of. "I am glad you tore up that contract," Jessa said softly. "So am I." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not been at the workyard that day?" "Sometimes," Quinton admitted, "but it does not help to think about it too much." "I think about it," Jessa said. "I think about how close I came to never having this. It makes me grateful, but it also makes me angry. There are so many people still in those wagons, still in those chains, and nobody is tearing up their contracts." "I know. You think we could help them, some of them?" Quinton was quiet for a moment. "I do not have enough money to buy out every debt contract in the county." "I know. But maybe we could help one or two, or maybe we could find other ways to make it harder for people like Klein to operate." She lifted her head to look at him. "I keep thinking that I got lucky, but luck should not be the only thing that stands between a person and freedom." "You are right," Quinton said, "but I do not know what we could do that would actually make a difference." "Neither do I," Jessa admitted, "but I want to think about it. I want to try." They sat together in the firelight, and Quinton felt the weight of her words settle into him. He had bought one woman's freedom on impulse, but impulse was not a system. If they were going to actually change anything, they would need a plan. Winter began to loosen its grip as the days grew longer. The snow melted in patches, revealing the muddy ground beneath. Quinton began getting more customers again as the roads cleared, and Jessa's sewing business picked up as people emerged from their winter hibernation in need of repairs and new clothes. It was on a mild day in early spring that the trouble arrived in the form of Harvey Klein, and two men Quinton did not recognize. He was in the workshop, fitting an iron tire to a wheel, when he heard the sound of horses in the yard. Quinton set down his tools and stepped outside to see Klein dismounting, a smug expression on his face. "Moss," Klein said, "been meaning to pay you a visit." "What do you want, Klein?" "I want what is mine. That orc woman you took off my hands, turns out the contract was not valid." Quinton's hand tightened on the hammer he was still holding. "I paid you 22 silver for that contract. You accepted the payment." "Ah, but that is the problem, you see." Klein pulled a paper from his coat and unfolded it. "Orc contracts fall under different regulations than human ones. Specifically, they cannot be bought out by private individuals, only by licensed labor contractors or the original debt holder. You did not have the legal right to purchase her contract, which means the sale was void. She still owes me 15 silver in labor." "That is a lie," Quinton said flatly. "It is right here in the County Labor Code, Section 12, subsection 4. Klein waved the paper. "I checked with the commission. They confirmed it, so I am here to collect my property." "She is not property. She is a free person." "Not according to the law." Klein gestured to the two men with him. "Now we can do this easy or we can do it hard. You send the girl out, I take her back to the work gang, and we forget this whole unpleasant business. You might even get some of your money back, minus an administrative fee." Quinton stepped forward, and the two men with Klein shifted their weight, hands moving toward the clubs at their belts. "You are not taking her anywhere," Quinton said. "I have the law on my side, Moss. You want to fight me on this, you will lose." The door to the house opened and Jessa emerged, her face pale but her jaw set. "What is going on?" "Stay inside," Quinton said. "He is here for me, is he not?" Jessa looked at Klein. "You said the contract was void." "It is void," Klein agreed. "Which means you are still bound by the original terms. 15 silver in labor, and you have not worked off a single copper of it in the last 6 months. That is breach of contract right there." "She has been working," Quinton said. "She has been earning her own wages. Working for you is not the same as working off her debt to me. The contract specifies she works in a licensed labor gang until the debt is satisfied." Klein's smile was vicious. "I am being generous, even offering to take her back. I could have her arrested for contract breach and add another 6 months to her term." Jessa's hands clenched at her sides, and Quinton could see the fear in her eyes warring with anger. He stepped between her and Klein. "I am not letting you take her," he said. "Then you will be in violation of the labor code, and I will have the sheriff out here by sundown." Klein folded his paper and returned it to his coat. "Face it, Moss. You thought you were doing something noble, but all you did was waste 22 silver on a contract you had no right to buy. The girl comes with me, or you both face charges. Your choice." Quinton's mind raced. If Klein was telling the truth about the law, then fighting him here would only make things worse. But the thought of watching Jessa go back to the chains, back to the wagon and the work gang, made his blood run cold. "I want to see the law for myself," Quinton said. "And I want a magistrate to rule on whether the contract was actually void." "A magistrate?" Klein laughed. "You want to take this to a magistrate? Fine, but she stays in my custody until the hearing." "No," Jessa said, her voice shaking. "I will not go back in that wagon." "You do not have a choice, girl." "There has to be another way," Quinton said. "Post a bond, something that keeps her here until the hearing." Klein considered this, his eyes calculating. "You want to post a bond? Fine. 30 silver to cover the debt and the potential penalties. You come up with 30 silver right now, and she can stay here until we see the magistrate. But if the ruling goes my way, I keep the bond and she comes back to the gang." 30 silver was everything Quinton had left in the bank, plus some. But the alternative was watching Klein chain Jessa and drag her away. "Wait here," he said. He went into the house and pulled out the strong box where he kept his savings. He counted out the coins twice to make sure. 28 silver, 3 copper. He was 2 silver short. Jessa appeared in the doorway. "Quinton, do not do this. I am not letting him take you. You cannot afford to lose 30 silver. That is your whole livelihood. I will figure it out." He looked up at her. "Do you trust me?" "With my life. But then trust me to do this." He stood and went to the bank account ledger where he tracked both his account and Jessa's. Her account had 6 silver in it, money she had earned and saved over the last months. "We need 2 more silver," he said. "Can I borrow it from your account? I will pay you back as soon as I can." Jessa crossed the room and opened a small pouch she kept in her sewing basket. She poured out the contents, 1 silver and 8 copper, her spending money. "Take it all," she said. "It is yours anyway. It is not mine, it is yours." "Then I am lending it to you." She pressed the coins into his hand. "But we do this together, Quinton. Whatever happens, we face it together." He closed his hand around the coins and pulled her into an embrace. She held him tightly, her face buried in his shoulder. "We are going to fight this," he said, "and we are going to win. What if we do not? Then we run. I will pack up everything we can carry and we will leave the county, find somewhere they cannot follow." Jessa pulled back to look at him. "You would do that? Give up everything you built here?" "I would," Quinton said, "but I do not think it will come to that. We will find a way to make this right." They gathered the 30 silver and Quinton went back outside. Klein was waiting with barely concealed impatience. "Took you long enough," he said. Quinton counted out the coins into Klein's outstretched hand. 30 silver, and I want a receipt." Klein pulled out a notebook and scrawled a receipt, which he handed over with a flourish. "There you go. The hearing will be in 2 weeks when the circuit magistrate comes through. Until then, she stays here, but if she runs, I keep the bond and have her arrested. Understood?" "Understood." Klein and his men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Quinton and Jessa standing in the yard. Quinton looked down at the receipt in his hand and felt the weight of what he had just done. He had gambled everything on a legal fight he did not understand, against a man who seemed to know the system inside and out. "We need help," Jessa said quietly. "I know, but I do not know who to ask. There is a woman in Milford who used to help people with legal problems. She was not a lawyer, but she knew the codes and she helped people fill out forms and understand their rights. Her name is Marta Devon. She might be able to help us." "Do you think she would?" "I do not know, but it is worth trying." The next day, they made the trip to Milford, a town about 10 miles east. It took them most of the morning to get there, and they spent the time talking through what they knew and what they needed to find out. Marta Devon lived above a bakery in the center of town. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers, and she listened to their story without interrupting. "This is a tricky situation," she said when they had finished. "Klein is technically correct that orc labor contracts fall under different regulations. But the question is whether those regulations actually prohibit private buyouts, or whether they just require different paperwork." "Can you help us figure that out?" Quinton asked. "I can try. I will need to review the county labor code and see what the actual language says." "Do you have a copy of the original contract?" "I tore it up," Quinton admitted. Marta raised an eyebrow. "Of course you did. All right, then I will need to get a copy from the county records. That will take a few days. The hearing is in 2 weeks. Then we do not have much time." Marta stood and went to a shelf crowded with books and ledgers. "Leave this with me. Come back in 3 days and I should have something for you." They thanked her and left, spending the rest of the day in Milford while Marta did her research. Quinton bought supplies and Jessa visited the seamstress shop where she used to work, a bittersweet reunion with her former employer who was shocked and delighted to see her. When they returned to the workshop that evening, Quinton found a note tacked to his door. It was from one of his regular customers, canceling a wheel order and stating that he did not want to do business with someone who was causing trouble with the Labor Commission. Jessa read the note over his shoulder. "This is going to get worse before it gets better, is it not?" "Probably," Quinton said, "but we are still going to fight." The next few days were tense. Quinton tried to focus on his work, but he kept waiting for Klein to show up with some new demand or for the sheriff to arrive with an arrest warrant. Jessa threw herself into her sewing, producing piece after piece with a frantic energy that worried him. "You do not have to work like this," he said, finding her late one night still stitching by lamplight. "I need to keep my hands busy," Jessa replied. "If I stop, I start thinking about what might happen. We are going to find a way through this. You keep saying that, but what if there is no way through? What if the law really is on Klein's side?" Quinton sat down beside her. "Then we make a new law. We fight it in front of the magistrate and we make the case that the law is unjust. And if that does not work, we take it to a higher court. And if that does not work, we leave and start over somewhere else. I do not want you to have to start over because of me. You are not a burden, Jessa. You are the best thing that has happened to me in years. If I have to start over, I will do it gladly as long as you are with me." She set down her sewing and leaned against him. "I am scared." "So am I," Quinton admitted, "but we will be scared together." 3 days later, they returned to Milford and found Marta waiting for them with a stack of papers and a grim expression. "I have good news and bad news," she said. "The good news is that Klein is wrong about the law. There is no provision in the county labor code that prohibits private individuals from buying out orc contracts. The regulations he cited apply to the transfer of contracts between labor contractors, not to private buyouts." Quinton felt a surge of relief. So the contract was valid. "Legally, yes. But here is the bad news. The Commission has discretion to invalidate contracts if they believe they were not executed in good faith. Klein is arguing that you bought the contract with the intent to immediately void it, which he is claiming constitutes fraud. How is freeing someone fraud? Because the purpose of a debt contract is to satisfy the debt through labor. If you buy a contract and immediately void it, the debt is not satisfied, which Klein is arguing means the original debt holder, him, is being defrauded of the labor owed. Jessa made a frustrated sound. So he is saying that Quinton defrauded him by not enslaving me. Essentially, yes. It is a ridiculous argument, but it is the one he is making, and we need to be prepared to counter it. How do we do that? Quinton asked. We need to make the case that voiding the contract was always your intent, and that there is nothing in the law that prohibits someone from buying a contract for the purpose of freeing the contracted party. We also need to show that the debt was satisfied by your payment, and that what happens after that is not the concern of the original debt holder. Will that work? It depends on the magistrate. If we get someone who is sympathetic, it might. If we get someone who is more concerned with maintaining the system, it might not. Marta handed them a folder. I have prepared a brief outlining the legal arguments. You will need to present this at the hearing and be prepared to answer questions. I do not know how to argue in front of a magistrate, Quinton said. You do not have to be eloquent. You just have to be honest and clear. Tell your story, explain why you did what you did, and let the magistrate decide. Marta looked at Jessa. And you should be prepared to testify as well. Your account of what happened will be important. Jessa nodded, though Quinton could see the fear in her eyes. They spent the next week preparing. Marta came to the workshop twice to coach them on what to expect and how to present their case. Quinton practiced his testimony until he could recite it without stumbling, and Jessa did the same, though she struggled with the parts where she had to talk about her time in the work gang. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear. The circuit magistrate was holding court at an inn at the crossroads, the same place where Quinton had first worked on Klein's wagon. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the novelty of a contract dispute involving an orc. The magistrate was a stern woman in her 50s named Helena Frith. She sat behind a table at the front of the inn's common room, a ledger and a stack of legal texts beside her. Klein was already there with his 2 hired men, looking confident. Marta sat with Quinton and Jessa, her expression calm but focused. We will hear the case of Klein versus Moss, Magistrate Frith announced. Mr. Klein, you are claiming that Mr. Moss defrauded you by voiding a contract he purchased from you. Present your argument. Klein stood and launched into a speech about the sanctity of contracts and the importance of the labor system. He painted Quinton as a naive fool who had been taken in by an orc's manipulations and who had damaged Klein's business by removing a valuable worker from his crew. The debt still exists, Klein said, and the debt can only be satisfied through labor, not through a fraudulent buyout. I am asking this court to invalidate the buyout and return the contracted party to my custody so the debt can be properly satisfied. When Klein sat down, Magistrate Frith turned to Quinton. Mr. Moss, your response. Quinton stood, his heart pounding. He looked at the brief Marta had prepared, then set it aside and spoke from the heart. I bought Jessa Erith's contract because I saw a person in chains and I had the money to free her. I did not think about the legal technicalities. I just thought about doing the right thing. Klein says I defrauded him, but I paid him what he asked. I paid him more than the debt was worth, because he inflated the price. The fraud, if there is any, is in the way he makes his living, trapping people in debt they can never escape and profiting off their labor. There was a murmur from the crowd. Magistrate Frith raised a hand for silence. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Moss," she said. "It is the truth. Jessa's brother died because he could not pay a 3 copper toll. Klein bought that debt and turned it into 18 silver, and then he sold it to Jessa because she was next of kin. That is not justice. That is exploitation." "The contracts are legal," Klein interjected. "Approved by the commission." "Legal does not mean just," Quinton shot back. "I looked away from injustice for years when I was in the army. I am not doing it anymore. I bought Jessa's contract and I freed her because it was the right thing to do. If that is fraud, then the law is broken." Magistrate Frith studied him for a long moment. "Miss Erith, do you have anything to add?" Jessa stood, her hands trembling slightly. "I just want to say that Quinton did not free me to defraud anyone. He freed me because he is a good person. And I have been free for 6 months now. I have worked and earned my own wages and lived my own life. Sending me back to the work gang would not satisfy any debt. It would just be cruelty." The magistrate made a note in her ledger. "I will hear testimony from any witnesses." Marta stood and presented the legal brief, walking through the arguments methodically. She cited precedents and code provisions, building a case that the buyout was legal and that Klein's fraud claim had no merit. When she finished, Klein called his 2 hired men to testify. They claimed that Jessa had been a troublemaker in the work gang, that she had tried to escape multiple times, that she was unreliable and dishonest. It was all lies, and Quinton could see the anger in Jessa's face as they spoke. When the testimony was done, Magistrate Frith called for a recess. She retired to a back room with her books and ledgers, leaving everyone to wait in tense silence. An hour passed. Quinton sat with Jessa and Marta, trying not to think about what would happen if they lost. Finally, Magistrate Frith returned and took her seat. "I have reviewed the evidence and the arguments," she said. "This is a complex case that touches on issues of contract law, labor regulations, and basic human decency. Mr. Klein's argument that the buyout was fraudulent rests on the premise that the only valid purpose of a contract buyout is to transfer the labor obligation. However, I find no provision in the law that restricts buyouts to that purpose. Mr. Moss was within his legal rights to purchase the contract and to void it immediately upon purchase." Quinton felt Jessa's hand find his under the table. "Furthermore," Magistrate Frith continued, "I find Mr. Klein's conduct in this matter to be troubling. He accepted payment for the contract in full and only raised the fraud claim after 6 months had passed. This suggests that his motivation is not to satisfy the debt, but to reclaim a worker he considers valuable. That is not an acceptable use of the legal system." Klein started to object, but Magistrate Frith cut him off with a sharp look. "The contract buyout is hereby ruled valid and binding. Miss Erith is a free person with no outstanding debt or obligation. Mr. Moss's bond of 30 silver will be returned to him in full. Additionally, I am fining Mr. Klein 5 silver for bringing a frivolous claim and wasting this court's time. He is also barred from holding any labor contracts in this county for a period of 1 year. The room erupted in noise. Klein was shouting something about appealing to a higher court. Jessa had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Quinton put his arm around her and held her as the reality of the ruling sank in. They had won. Marta was grinning, looking more pleased than Quinton had ever seen her. "Well done," she said, "both of you." It took another hour to finish the paperwork and collect the bond. Klein left in a fury, his hired men trailing behind him. The crowd dispersed, some people congratulating Quinton and others muttering about the magistrate's ruling. By the time they left the inn, the sun was starting to set. They rode home in silence, both of them too overwhelmed to speak. It was not until they were back at the workshop, standing in the familiar yard, that Jessa finally broke down. She cried for a long time, and Quinton held her, letting her release the fear and tension she had been carrying for weeks. When she finally calmed, she pulled back and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "It is really over?" she asked. "It is really over," Quinton confirmed. "You are free, legally, officially free. I do not know what to do now." "You do not have to do anything, just be free. That is enough." They went inside and Jessa made tea while Quinton lit the fire. They sat together in the gathering darkness, sipping from their cups and slowly letting the weight of the last week's lift. "Thank you," Jessa said quietly. "You do not have to thank me. I do, though. You risked everything for me. Your money, your business, your reputation, you could have lost it all. But I did not," Quinton said. "We won. And even if we had lost, I would not regret trying." Jessa set down her cup and moved closer to him on the bench. She took his face in her hands and looked at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I love you," she said. It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. Quinton felt the words settle into his chest, warm and solid. "I love you too," he said. They kissed, tentative at first and then deeper, and when they finally pulled apart, Quinton felt like something had shifted irrevocably between them. This was not just companionship or affection. This was a commitment, a choice they were both making with full knowledge of what it meant. "I want to build a life with you," Jessa said. "A real life, not just sharing a house. I want to be your partner in every sense of the word." "I want that too," Quinton said. "But you should know, people are going to have opinions about us, about a human and an orc together. It is not going to be easy. I know, but nothing worth having is easy." She smiled, and it was fierce and beautiful. "We already fought for this once. We can do it again if we have to. Then let's do it together." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Jessa wanted to expand her sewing business, maybe take on an apprentice. Quinton wanted to build a larger workshop with space for more ambitious projects. They talked about the future with a hope that had been impossible a few months ago, when Jessa was still in chains and Quinton was still living alone. Spring turned to summer, and the workshop thrived. Word of the magistrate's ruling spread, and Quinton found that while he lost some customers, he gained others who admired what he had done. Jessa's sewing business grew as well, and she began taking on more complex commissions, including a wedding dress for the mayor's daughter that earned her a reputation as a skilled craftswoman. They settled into a rhythm, working during the day and spending their evenings together. Quinton taught Jessa how to work with wood, and she taught him the basics of sewing, though he remained hopeless at anything more complicated than a basic hem. They laughed a lot, argued occasionally about inconsequential things, and learned the particular intimacy of two people building a shared life. As summer deepened, Jessa began to talk about wanting to do more to help people like her, those trapped in debt contracts with no way out. She and Quinton started setting aside money each month, a fund that they could use to buy out other contracts. It was not much, but it was something, a way of turning their own fortune into a tool for others. They also reached out to Marta and began working with her to document cases of contract abuse. It was slow work, and they knew it would take years to make any real change, but they were committed to trying. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jessa said, "I want to ask you something, but I am nervous about it." "You can ask me anything," Quinton said. Jessa took a breath. "I want to marry you. But I also want to make sure I am coming to you as an equal, not as someone you saved. So I did something." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. Quinton unfolded it and saw that it was a deed to a small plot of land adjacent to his property. "I bought it with my savings," Jessa explained. "It is only half an acre, but it is mine. I own it outright, no debt, no obligation. So when I ask you to marry me, I am not coming empty-handed. I have something of my own to bring to this partnership." Quinton looked at the deed, then at Jessa. "You bought land so you could propose to me. I wanted to be sure you knew I was choosing you as an equal, not out of gratitude or obligation." She took his hand. "Quinton Moss, will you marry me?" "Yes," Quinton said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." They kissed, and it felt like sealing a promise that had been building since the day he unlocked her chains. When they pulled apart, Jessa was grinning. "I did not have a ring or anything," she said. "I spent all my money on the land. I do not need a ring." Quinton stood and pulled her to her feet. "Wait here." He went inside and returned with the cherry wood box he had made, the one Jessa had told him to fill with something important. He opened it and pulled out two things: the receipt Klein had given him for the 30 silver bond, and the torn pieces of Jessa's contract that he had collected from the ground and kept. "I know these probably are not what you meant when you said to put something important in here," he said. "But they feel right. This is where we started, and I want to remember that." Jessa looked at the scraps of paper and her eyes filled with tears. "That is perfect." They spent the next weeks planning a simple wedding. They did not have a lot of money for a big celebration, but they did not want one anyway. What they wanted was something meaningful, surrounded by the people who had supported them. Marta agreed to officiate, using her authority as a notary to perform the ceremony. They invited a handful of friends and customers, including the farmer's wife, who had been one of Jessa's first sewing clients, and the blacksmith from town, who had always treated them with respect. The ceremony took place in the yard of the workshop on a clear autumn day. Jessa wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue that complemented her green skin. Quinton wore his best shirt and trousers, newly mended by Jessa's skilled hands. They stood beneath an arch that Quinton had built from oak branches, holding hands as Marta spoke about the nature of commitment and choice. When it came time for the vows, Quinton went first. "Jessa, when I met you, you were in chains, but you were not defeated. You had a strength in you that I admired from the first moment. You taught me that freedom is not just about breaking chains, but about building a life worth living. I promise to be your partner, your equal, and your support for as long as I live. I choose you, today and every day." Jessa's voice was steady when she spoke her vows. "Quinton, you gave me freedom when you did not have to, and then you gave me space to decide what to do with it. You saw me as a person when others saw me as property. You taught me that love is not about owing, but about choosing. I promise to stand with you, to build with you, and to love you for as long as we both live. I choose you, today and every day." Marta pronounced them married, and they kissed to the cheers of their small gathering. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, with food and music and the kind of easy laughter that comes from genuine happiness. As the sun set and their guests began to depart, Quinton and Jessa stood together in the yard, watching the last light fade from the sky. "We did it," Jessa said. "We actually did it." "We did," Quinton agreed. "And this is just the beginning." They went inside and climbed the stairs together, no longer to separate rooms but to the larger bedroom they had been preparing. It was a space they had built together, with a bed frame Quinton had crafted and curtains Jessa had sewn, a tangible symbol of the life they were creating. The years that followed were not always easy. There were still people who disapproved of their marriage, who refused to do business with them, or who made their prejudice known in small, cutting ways. But there were also allies, people who supported them and celebrated their success. Quinton's business grew, and he eventually took on an apprentice, a young man from town who wanted to learn the wheelwright trade. Jessa's sewing business became so successful that she had to hire help, bringing on 2 younger women who were eager to learn from her. They used their growing prosperity to continue their work helping others trapped in debt contracts. Over the years, they bought out 5 more contracts, freeing people who had no other hope of escape. It was not enough to change the system, but it was something, and it mattered to the people they helped. 2 years into their marriage, Jessa discovered she was pregnant. It was unexpected but welcome, and Quinton threw himself into preparing for the arrival of their child. He built a cradle from maple wood, carved with intricate patterns, and Jessa sewed tiny clothes with the same care she brought to all her work. Their son was born on a snowy day in midwinter, healthy and loud. They named him Garrett, and he had Jessa's amber eyes and Quinton's stubborn chin. He was beautiful and terrifying in the way that all new life is, and Quinton held him with trembling hands and promised to be the father he deserved. Raising Garrett came with its own challenges. There were people who made unkind comments about his mixed heritage, and there were moments when Quinton felt a fierce protectiveness that bordered on rage. But there were also moments of pure joy. Garrett's first steps, his first words, the way he laughed when Quinton tossed him in the air. When Garrett was 3, Jessa became pregnant again, and they welcomed a daughter they named Joanna. She was quieter than her brother, with Quinton's sandy hair and Jessa's pointed ears. The family felt complete in a way that Quinton had never imagined possible. The workshop expanded again, and Quinton built a new building adjacent to the original one to house Jessa's sewing operation. They hired more help and took on larger projects, becoming a fixture in the community, despite the prejudice that still lingered. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch Garrett and Joanna play in the yard, and Quinton would think about the day he first saw Jessa in that work yard, hollow-cheeked and shackled. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet the memory was still sharp. "You ever regret it?" Jessa asked one such evening as though reading his thoughts. Regret what? All of this. The fight, the money, the complications. It would have been easier to walk away. "I do not spend time wondering about easier paths," Quinton said. "This is the life I chose, the life we chose. And I love it, even the hard parts." "Me too," Jessa said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Garrett ran up to them, holding something in his hands. "Look what I found," he announced, showing them a smooth river stone. "That is a fine stone," Quinton said seriously. "What are you going to do with it?" "I am going to keep it in my special box," Garrett declared, and he ran off to add it to his collection. "He is just like you," Jessa said with amusement, "always building and keeping things." "And Joanna is just like you," Quinton replied, "always watching and thinking." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The workshop stood solid behind them, a testament to years of work and love. The land stretched out around them, the half-acre Jessa had bought, and the plot Quinton had owned, now merged into a single property that belonged to them both. Autumn arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of their wedding. They had been married for 5 years, and the day felt worth marking. Quinton closed the workshop early, and they took the children into town for a special meal at the tavern. The tavern keeper, now familiar with the family, greeted them warmly and found them a good table. They ate well, and afterward, Quinton and Jessa walked through the town square while Garrett and Joanna chased each other in circles. "I have been thinking about something," Jessa said. "What is that?" "I want to start a fund to help people buy their way out of debt contracts. Not just us using our own money, but a real fund that other people can contribute to. Maybe we could get the community involved, make it something bigger than just our own efforts." Quinton considered this. "That is ambitious, I know, but I think it could work. There are people in this community who believe in fairness, who would support the idea if we gave them the opportunity. "All right," Quinton said. "Let's try it. We will talk to Marta, see if she has ideas for how to set it up legally." Jessa smiled, and it was the same fierce, determined smile she had worn the day she proposed. "We are going to change things, Quinton. Maybe not all at once, but slowly over time." "I believe you," Quinton said, and he meant it. They started the fund with a donation of 10 silver from their own savings and began reaching out to people in the community. The response was mixed. Some people were enthusiastic, contributing what they could and spreading the word. Others were suspicious or outright hostile, seeing it as an attack on the established order. But slowly, the fund grew. Marta helped them set up the legal structure, ensuring that the money would be used only for buying out debt contracts and could not be misappropriated. They established a committee to review cases and decide which contracts to pursue, with Jessa and Quinton serving as founding members but not sole decision-makers. The first contract they bought out through the fund was for a young human man who had been sold into debt after his father's farm failed. The second was for a dwarf woman who had been working for a construction contractor. Each success brought new attention to the fund, and slowly, donations increased. It was not revolutionary. The system of debt contracts remained largely intact, and there were still contractors like Klein operating throughout the county. But it was progress, and it mattered to the people they helped. Each freed person was a small victory, a crack in the edifice of injustice. As the years passed, Garrett and Joanna grew. Garrett developed a love for woodworking and began spending time in the workshop with Quinton, learning to shape and join pieces with the same care his father brought to the craft. Joanna showed an aptitude for sewing and often sat with Jessa, her small hands learning to guide needle and thread. The family became a known presence in the community, and while there were still those who harbored prejudice, there were also those who came to see them as neighbors and friends. The workshop continued to prosper, and the fund continued to grow. One spring day, when Garrett was 10 and Joanna was 7, a stranger arrived at the workshop. He was an orc, broad-shouldered and travel-worn, and he asked to speak with Jessa. Jessa came out of the house to meet him, and Quinton watched from the workshop as they talked. He saw the moment Jessa's face changed, saw the recognition and shock, and he set down his tools and walked over. "Quinton, this is Darren," Jessa said, her voice shaking slightly. "He is my youngest sister's husband. He came to tell me that my family is looking for me." The news hit Quinton like a blow. Jessa had not seen her family since before she was sold into debt, and he knew she had assumed they thought her dead or beyond reach. "They have been searching for you for years," Darren said. "Your sisters never gave up hope." When they heard about the fund, about the woman freeing debt workers, they started asking questions. "It took time to confirm, but they are sure it is you." Jessa looked at Quinton, her eyes brimming with tears. "They want to see me." "Then you should go," Quinton said immediately. "We will all go if they will have us." So they made the journey west, into the hills where Jessa had grown up. It took 3 days of travel, and Garrett and Joanna were endlessly curious about the changing landscape and the prospect of meeting relatives they had never known existed. The orc community where Jessa had been raised was smaller than Quinton had expected, a collection of sturdy homes built into the hillside. They were greeted with a mixture of wariness and wonder, but when Jessa's sisters emerged from one of the houses, all caution evaporated. The reunion was tearful and joyful. Jessa's 3 sisters were all younger than her, and they had children of their own now, cousins for Garrett and Joanna to meet and play with. Quinton stood back and let Jessa have her moment, watching as years of separation melted away in embraces and laughter. Later, when things had calmed, Jessa's eldest sister, Mira, approached Quinton. "Thank you for taking care of her," Mira said. "We thought we had lost her forever." "She took care of herself," Quinton replied. "I just helped where I could." "You did more than that. She told us what you did, how you freed her. That took courage." "It took money and stubbornness, mostly." Mira smiled. "Those helped too, but you made her happy, we can see that, and you gave her a family." "She gave me one too," Quinton said. They stayed in the hills for a week, and it was a time of healing for Jessa. She reconnected with her sisters, met nieces and nephews, and visited her parents' graves. Quinton saw a lightness in her that had not been there before, as though a weight she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. On the last night before they left, they gathered around a fire with Jessa's extended family. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and Garrett and Joanna fell asleep against Quinton's shoulders, exhausted from days of play with their cousins. Jessa sat beside him, her hand in his, and Quinton felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had built. It was not the life he had imagined when he was a soldier driving wagons for the army. It was not the life Jessa had imagined when she was a seamstress in Milford. But it was theirs, and it was good. The journey home felt different, lighter somehow. They talked about the possibility of Jessa's sisters visiting them, about building connections between their community and the workshop. Garrett and Joanna chattered about their new cousins and begged to go back soon. When they finally arrived home, the workshop looked welcoming and familiar. Quinton helped the children down from the cart and carried their bags inside while Jessa stood in the yard, looking at the buildings she had helped build and the land they owned together. "This is home," she said when Quinton came back out. "It is," he agreed. "I am glad we came back." "Me too." They went inside and settled the children into bed, then sat together at the table with cups of tea. The house was quiet, and Quinton found himself thinking about the cherry wood box upstairs, the one that held the scraps of a torn contract and a receipt for 30 silver. "I want to add something to the box," Jessa said, as though reading his mind again. "What?" She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was the deed to the half-acre of land she had bought so many years ago, the one she had used to propose. "I want to put this in there too," she said. "As a reminder that I chose this, that I chose you, not out of necessity but out of love." Quinton took the deed and looked at it, remembering the day she had shown it to him, the nervous hope in her eyes. "That is perfect," he said. They added the deed to the box, and Quinton set it back on the shelf where it lived. It was a small thing, a collection of papers that most people would consider rubbish. But to them, it was a history, a record of where they had started and how far they had come. The years continued to roll forward. Garrett grew into a young man with a talent for craftsmanship that rivaled Quinton's own. Joanna became a skilled seamstress, and eventually took over much of the day-to-day management of Jessa's sewing business. The fund they had started continued to operate, freeing dozens of people from debt contracts over the years. Quinton's hair began to gray at the temples, and Jessa's hands developed the calluses and strength that came from decades of work. They grew older together, facing the challenges that came with time, but always facing them as partners. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they gathered in the yard with Garrett, Joanna, and their families. Garrett had married a human woman from town, and they had a son of their own. Joanna had found love with a half-elf carpenter, and they were expecting their first child. The workshop had expanded yet again, now a thriving enterprise that employed a dozen people and served customers from across the county. The sewing business was equally successful, and Jessa had trained several apprentices who had gone on to open their own shops. As Quinton looked around at the gathered family, at the buildings they had built, and the life they had created, he felt a deep contentment. This was what freedom looked like, not just the absence of chains but the presence of choice, of love, of purpose. Jessa stood and raised her cup. "I want to make a toast," she said, "to my husband who saw a person where others saw property. To our children who carry forward the values we try to teach them. To our family and friends who have supported us through everything. And to the future, which looks brighter because of the choices we made together." Everyone raised their cups and drank, and Quinton felt Jessa's hand find his under the table, her grip warm and familiar. Later, after the celebration had wound down and their guests had departed, Quinton and Jessa walked through the workshop together. They moved among the tools and materials, the half-finished projects and the completed works waiting for pickup. "You remember the first thing you said to me?" Jessa asked. "I told you that you were free. And I said I chose you." "You did," Quinton said. "And I spent weeks trying to talk you out of it. You wanted to make sure it was real, that I had actually tasted freedom before I chose to share it with you." "Did you?" "Taste freedom, I mean." Jessa considered the question. "I think freedom is not a single moment. It is a series of choices, made over and over again. I tasted it that first day when you tore up the contract. I tasted it every time I earned my own wages and made my own decisions. I taste it now, standing here with you, knowing that I am exactly where I want to be." "I am exactly where I want to be too," Quinton said. They locked up the workshop and walked back to the house, their steps in sync after so many years together. The stars were bright overhead, and the night was peaceful. Inside, they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, the same room they had shared for 2 decades. Quinton pulled out the cherry wood box and opened it, looking at the contents. The torn contract, the receipt, the deed, each piece a marker of their journey. "We should add something new," Jessa said. "Like what?" She thought for a moment, then went to her sewing basket and pulled out a scrap of blue fabric, a leftover from the dress she had worn at their wedding. "This," she said. "To remember that this started with a choice and it has been sustained by choosing each other every day since." Quinton added the fabric to the box and closed the lid. It fit perfectly, as it always had, the seams invisible and the wood glowing in the lamplight. They lay down together, Jessa's head resting on Quinton's shoulder, and talked quietly about nothing in particular. Small things, comfortable things, the kind of conversation that happens between people who know each other completely. "I love you," Jessa said, as she had said countless times over the years. "I love you too," Quinton replied, and meant it with the same depth he had felt the first time he said it. They drifted off to sleep together, safe and content, 2 people who had chosen each other and built a life from that choice. The workshop stood solid outside, a testament to their work. The fun they had started continued to free people from unjust bonds. Their children carried forward the values they had tried to instill. And in a cherry wood box on the shelf, scraps of paper and fabric told the story of how it all began, with chains being unlocked, freedom being offered, and a choice being made. Not out of gratitude or obligation, but out of love freely given and freely returned. A choice made once and then made again and again, day after day, year after year, until it became not just a choice but a life, full and rich and entirely their own.